Hey guys, tonight we're delving into the dark, mysterious, and often misunderstood world of medieval witches. Those enigmatic figures who lurked in the shadows of European society, feared and reviled, yet sometimes secretly sought after. While pop culture might romanticize their lives, the truth is, being a medieval witch was a terrifying and dangerous existence. So before we dim the candles and start our journey, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you re-tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now settle in, maybe light some incense for that authentic medieval ambience. And let's ease into tonight's tale together. Let's be clear. No one in medieval times woke up and said, "You know what? I'd love to be accused of consorting with the devil, have my neighbors shun me, and potentially face a fiery death at the stake." Becoming a witch wasn't a career choice. It was more like finding yourself on the wrong side of superstition, fear, and social paranoia. Imagine, if you will, a world where the line between the natural and supernatural was as thin as a wisp of smoke, where a simple herbal remedy could be seen as either a blessing or a curse, depending on who was watching. This was the reality for many women in medieval Europe. They didn't have pointy hats or fly on broomsticks. Instead, they were often just ordinary people with a bit more knowledge about plants or a tendency to keep to themselves. But here's the kicker. In a society gripped by religious fervor and fear of the unknown, being different was dangerous. A woman who knew how to ease childbirth pain with herbs, she might be celebrated one day and accused of witchcraft the next. It was a precarious existence, walking the tightrope between healer and heretic. Now, let's talk about the day-to-day life of our medieval witch. Contrary to popular belief, they didn't spend their days cackling over cauldrons or dancing naked in the woods. Instead, many lived in constant fear of discovery. Imagine trying to help your community with your knowledge of natural remedies, all while looking over your shoulder, wondering if that neighbor you helped last week might turn you in to save their own skin. And here's a fun fact that might surprise you. The stereotypical image of the witch's familiar, the black cat or toad, actually came from a much more mundane reality. Many of these so-called witches were simply lonely old women who found comfort in the company of animals. But in the eyes of a superstitious society, that harmless pet cat could be seen as a demonic familiar, sealing their fate. But it wasn't all gloom and doom. Some of these accused witches managed to carve out a niche for themselves, becoming respected members of their communities. They were the ones people turned to when official medicine failed, when crops needed blessing, or when someone needed a little extra help in the love department. It was a dangerous game of reputation and results. Now, let's talk about one of the most fascinating aspects of medieval witch life, the gatherings. No, I'm not talking about the wild sabbats of legend. I'm talking about the secret meetings where knowledge was shared, skills were honed, and a sense of community was forged. These weren't grand affairs with hundreds of witches flying in from all over. They were small, secretive gatherings in forest clearings or hidden caves, where women could be themselves without fear of judgment or persecution. But here's the thing. Even these gatherings were fraught with danger. One wrong move, one loose tongue, and the whole group could find themselves facing the witch hunter's wrath. It was a high-stakes game of trust and secrecy that would make modern-day spies sweat. Speaking of witch hunters, Let's shine a light on these charming individuals. Imagine a job where your sole purpose is to find and expose people for crimes that, in many cases, they didn't even commit. These guys were part detective, part inquisitor, and all nightmare fuel for anyone accused of witchcraft. They had an arsenal of cruel tests and tortures designed to extract confessions, whether true or not. One particularly nasty method was the swimming test. The accused would be bound and thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank ... well, at least they died innocent, right? It was a lose-lose situation that makes you wonder who the real monsters were. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of a medieval witch's life was the constant silence. Imagine having knowledge that could help people, skills that could ease suffering, but knowing that using them could lead to your death. It was a life of half-truths, coded language, and meaningful glances. Every interaction was a potential trap, every kindness a possible betrayal. And yet, despite all this, these accused witches persevered. They continued to help their communities in secret, passing down knowledge from mother to daughter, mentor to apprentice. They were the keepers of ancient wisdom, the protectors of forgotten lore, all while living under the shadow of the stake. Now, as we approach the end of our first journey tonight, let's consider the legacy of these medieval witches. Their story is one of resilience in the face of overwhelming odds, of knowledge preserved despite attempts to stamp it out. In many ways, they were the unsung heroes of their time, braving persecution to keep alive traditions and knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. So the next time you see a stereotypical witch in a movie or Halloween decoration, remember the real women behind the myth. They weren't evil sorceresses or devil worshippers. They were healers, wise women, and keepers of knowledge, living in a world that feared what it didn't understand. I hope you enjoyed our first journey into the past has given you a new perspective on those who are branded as witches. Remember, history is often more complex and nuanced than we first assume. So keep an open mind, question what you think you know, and always be kind to your neighborhood cat, just in case. Whispers in the dark, rumors in the shadows, and fear creeping through every village. That's how witch hunts really began in medieval Europe. But forget what you've seen in movies or read in fantasy novels. The real story's a lot messier, a lot weirder, and a whole lot more human. Most accused witches weren't cackling hags brewing potions in remote cottages. They were your average Jane or Joe, trying to scrape by in a world where life was cheap and death was always knocking. If you had a wart, a cat, or just rubbed someone the wrong way, congratulations. You might be next on the witch finder's list. Now you might think witch hunters were trained professionals, experts in sniffing out evil. Nope. They were often just regular folks with a grudge, a wild imagination, or a desperate need for cash. If you could point a finger and shout, "Witch!" convincingly, you were qualified. Picture this. It's 1450, and you're living in a tiny village where everyone knows your business. The crops are failing. Your neighbor's cow just died, and suddenly, old Margaret down the street looks mighty suspicious with her herb garden and that shifty-eyed cat. Never mind that Margaret's been delivering babies and curing colds for decades. Times are tough, and someone's got to take the blame. But here's the kicker. Accusing someone of witchcraft wasn't just about superstition. It was often a twisted form of social control. Got a woman who's a bit too outspoken? A widower with land you fancy? Witch accusations were the medieval equivalent of a smear campaign. only with far deadlier consequences. And let's talk about those consequences. Forget the dramatic burnings at the stake you see in movies. While that did happen, it wasn't the norm everywhere. In some places, accused witches faced drowning, hanging, or even being pressed to death with heavy stones. Talk about your rock-bottom experiences. Now, you might be wondering, how did people prove someone was a witch? Well, buckle up, because this is where things get really bizarre. Ever heard of the swimming test? They'd tie you up and chuck you in a river. If you floated, congrats, you're a witch. If you sank ... well, at least you died innocent. It was a real lose-lose situation. But wait, there's more. Witch hunters had all sorts of creative methods. They'd look for witch marks, basically any odd birthmark or scar. They'd prick your skin with needles, looking for spots that didn't bleed. Some even believed witches had extra nipples to feed their demonic familiars. Suddenly, that mole you never liked took on a whole new, terrifying meaning. Let's not forget the confessions. Torture was a popular pastime for witch hunters, and they got real creative with it. Sleep deprivation, starvation, and good old-fashioned physical abuse were all on the menu. Under those conditions, you'd probably confess to being the tooth fairy if it meant the pain would stop. But here's a surprising twist. Not everyone accused of witchcraft was doomed. Some communities were more skeptical than others. In fact, in some areas, you had a better chance of surviving a witch accusation than dying from the common cold. Small comfort, but hey, you take what you can get in the Middle Ages. Speaking of surprises, did you know that men were accused of witchcraft too? While women were the primary targets, plenty of guys found themselves on the wrong end of a witch hunt. In some regions, up to 25% of the accused were male. Equal opportunity paranoia, folks. Now, let's talk about the real MVPs of the witch hunt era, the skeptics. Yes, believe it or not everyone was on board with the whole burn the witch craze. Some brave souls dared to question the logic behind witch hunts. They were the medieval equivalent of that one friend who always ruins the ghost story by pointing out plot holes. One such skeptic was Johannes Weyer, a 16th century physician who argued that many accused witches were actually suffering from mental illness. He suggested that maybe, just maybe, we shouldn't be burning people for having delusions. Revolutionary concept, right? But for every voice of reason, there were dozens ready to fan the flames of hysteria. Witch-hunting manuals like the infamous Malleus Maleficarum were bestsellers of their time. These books were basically witch hunting for dummies, complete with handy tips on how to spot, interrogate, and convict a witch. Because nothing says justice like a step-by-step guide to persecution. As we wind down our journey through the dark and twisty world of medieval witch hunts, let's take a moment to appreciate how far we've come. Sure, we still have our share of paranoia and scapegoating, but at least we're not dunking people in rivers to prove their innocence anymore. Progress, folks. In the end, the story of witch hunts isn't just about superstition or evil. It's a tale of human nature at its most fearful, its most power-hungry, and sometimes its most courageous. It's a reminder that in times of uncertainty and hardship, we're all too ready to point fingers and find someone to blame. So the next time you're tempted to cry witch at your neighbor for letting their dog bark all night, maybe take a deep breath and count to 10 instead. After all, you never know when the tables might turn, and you'll find yourself trying to prove you're not made of wood. And remember, in the grand scheme of things, We're all just trying to muddle through life without getting accused of dancing with the devil or turning someone into a newt. Some days are easier than others, but hey, at least we're not living in the 1400s. Now that's something to be thankful for. Welcome to the twisted world of medieval witch hunts, where logic takes a backseat and paranoia reigns supreme. Most folks think witch-finders were learned scholars with fancy degrees. But let's be real. They were often just regular Joes with a knack for pointing fingers and a thirst for drama. Picture this. You're living in 15th century Europe, minding your own business, when suddenly your neighbor accuses you of turning their cow's milk sour. Next thing you know, you're being dragged to the town square, facing a self-proclaimed witch-finder who's about as qualified to judge your innocence as a chicken is to perform brain surgery. These witch-finders weren't trained in fancy schools or given special powers by the church. Nah, they were more like medieval freelancers, hustling from town to town, promising to root out evil for a few coins and maybe a free meal. If you had a grudge against someone and enough cash to spare, you could basically hire your own personal witch hunter. Talk about a unique gift idea for that special someone you secretly hate. Now, you might be wondering, how did these amateur sleuths actually prove someone was a witch? Well, buckle up, because we're about to dive into the absolutely bonkers world of medieval witch trials. First up, we've got the classic trial by water. This genius method involved tying up the accused and tossing them into a body of water. If they floated, congrats, you're a witch. If they sank, well, at least you died an innocent person, right? It's a win-win situation, except for the whole drowning part. But wait, there's more. Ever heard of the witch's mark? Witch-finders would strip their suspects naked and search every nook and cranny for any unusual marks, moles, or birthmarks. Found a weird spot? Witch. Got a third nipple? Double witch. It's like a twisted game of connect the dots, where the prize is a one-way ticket to the stake. And let's not forget the infamous pricking test. Witch-finders would poke and prod their victims with needles, looking for spots that didn't bleed or hurt. Of course, they often used trick needles with retractable points, because nothing says fair trial like a rigged carnival game. Now you might be thinking, surely people saw through these ridiculous methods, right? Well, my friend, you'd be surprised. Fear and superstition were powerful forces in medieval Europe. When crops failed or diseases spread, people needed someone to blame, and witches were the perfect scapegoats. But here's the kicker. Most of the people accused of witchcraft weren't cackling hags stirring cauldrons in the woods. They were often just ordinary folks who rubbed someone the wrong way. Maybe you were a widow with a suspiciously healthy herb garden. Or perhaps you were the village oddball who talked to your cats a little too much. Congratulations, you're now prime witch material. The sad truth is, once you were accused of witchcraft, you are pretty much doomed. The trials were designed to prove guilt, not innocence. Confess, and you might get a slightly less painful death. Deny it, and you're in for a world of hurt until you do confess. It's like playing a game where the rules change every 5 minutes, and the only prize is varying degrees of misery. Let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer absurdity of some of the evidence used in these trials. Ever sneezed at an inconvenient time? Witch. Did your cow produce more milk than your neighbor's? Definitely a witch. Did you happen to be really good at predicting the weather? You guessed it, witch with a side of weather control powers. But wait, there's more. Some witch-finders got really creative with their methods. Ever heard of the witch cake? This involved mixing the accused person's urine into a cake, feeding it to a dog, and then watching to see if the accused felt pain when the dog was beaten. Because nothing says justice like animal cruelty in a very confused canine. And let's not forget the classic swimming test. This involved stripping the accused, tying their right thumb to their left big toe, and their left thumb to their right big toe, then tossing them into water. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, they were innocent, or probably dead. It's like a medieval version of heads I win, tails you lose. Now you might be wondering, who in their right mind would become a witch finder? Well, it wasn't exactly a career path you'd find at the local job fair. Many witch finders were just opportunists looking to make a quick buck. Some were religious zealots convinced they were doing God's work. And others? Well, they were probably just really into kinky stuff and found a socially acceptable way to indulge their fetishes. But here's the thing. Being a witch finder wasn't all fun and games. Sure, you got to travel, meet new people, and then accuse them of consorting with the devil. But it was also a pretty risky gig. If you accused the wrong person, someone with actual power or influence, you could find yourself on the wrong end of a pitchfork. And let's face it, after a while, all those witch trials must have gotten pretty boring. Oh, look, another person who can't float. Shocker. As we wrap up our journey through the bizarre world of medieval witch hunts, let's take a moment to reflect on how far we've come. These days, if someone accuses you of being a witch, you can just laugh it off and go back to binge-watching your favorite show about teenage witches attending a magical school. Progress, am I right? But in all seriousness, the witch trials of medieval Europe were a dark chapter in human history. They were fueled by fear, ignorance, and a desperate need to explain the unexplainable. In a world where life was often short, brutal, and filled with hardship, the idea that there were evil forces at work was oddly comforting. At least it meant there was some rhyme or reason to the chaos. So the next time you're having a bad day, just remember, at least you're not being dunked in a river to prove you're not in league with Satan. Unless that's your thing, in which case, no judgment here. Just maybe keep it to yourself, or you might attract the attention of the local witch finder. And trust me, that's one Tinder match you definitely want to swipe left on. In medieval Europe, witches weren't mysterious hags brewing potions in remote forest huts. They were your neighbors, the local healers, and sometimes even your own grandmother. If you had land, a title, or even a measly goat to your name, you were safe from accusations. But if you were a woman living on society's fringes, with a reputation for solving problems and a knack for sneaking into places unnoticed, you might find yourself in hot water, or worse, tied to a stake. Welcome to the dark and twisted world of witch victims, where logic took a backseat to superstition and fear ruled the day. Grab a comfy seat, maybe light a candle, and let's dive into the peculiar tale of who really got labeled as witches in medieval times. Picture this. You're a midwife in a small village, known for helping women through childbirth. You've got a collection of herbs. You mutter soothing words during labor. And sometimes, when things go well, people whisper that you have a magic touch. Congratulations. You're now prime witch material. Midwives were often the first to be suspected when things went wrong. Baby born with a birthmark? Must be a witch's curse. Mother dies in childbirth? Clearly, the midwife made a pact with the devil. Never mind that childbirth was incredibly dangerous back then, and the midwives were actually saving lives left and right. Nope, it was all about that sweet, sweet witchcraft. But it wasn't just midwives who had to watch their backs. Widows were another favorite target for witch accusations. Imagine surviving your husband in a time when women had few rights and even fewer job opportunities. You're left alone, maybe with some property, and suddenly your neighbors start eyeing you suspiciously. Why? Because a woman with independence was clearly in league with Satan himself. These poor widows often found themselves in a lose-lose situation. If they remarried quickly, they were seen as disloyal to their late husbands. If they remained single and managed to support themselves, they must be using dark magic. And if they fell on hard times and had to beg, well, that was just proof that they'd been cursed for their wicked ways. Now, let's talk about the real MVPs of witch accusations, the village outcasts. These were the folks who didn't quite fit in, the ones who talked to themselves, or had a few too many cats. Maybe they had a wart on their nose, or just rubbed people the wrong way. In a time when conformity was key to survival, being different was a dangerous game. Take, for example, the story of old Meg from a small English village. Meg lived alone on the outskirts of town, gathering herbs and occasionally helping sick animals. She was known for her sharp tongue and her refusal to attend church regularly. When the local baker's bread failed to rise one day, guess who got blamed? Poor Meg found herself hauled before the local magistrate, accused of cursing the yeast with her evil eye. But here's the kicker. Most of these so-called witches weren't cackling evildoers or secret devil worshippers. They were just regular folks trying to get by in a world that was often cruel and unforgiving. The real crime? Being poor, being female, or just being a little bit different. Now, you might be wondering, why didn't these accused witches just deny the charges? Oh, sweet summer child. Denying witchcraft was seen as proof that you were, in fact, a witch. It was a classic damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Confess, and you're burned at the stake. Deny it, and you're also burned at the stake, but with the added bonus of being tortured first. Speaking of torture, let's take a moment to appreciate the creativity of medieval witch hunters. They had an arsenal of delightful tools and tests to determine if someone was a witch. There was the infamous swimming test, where the accused was thrown into a body of water. If they floated, they were a witch. If they sank and drowned, well, at least they died innocent, right? Then there was the pricking test, where suspected witches were poked with needles to find insensitive spots that might be devil's marks. And let's not forget the classic spectral evidence, where dreams and visions were admissible in court. Because nothing says justice like convicting someone based on your neighbor's nightmare. But it wasn't all doom and gloom for the accused. Some clever folks managed to turn witch accusations to their advantage. Take the case of Cunning Moll, a wise woman from a coastal village. When accused of causing storms at sea, she didn't deny it. Instead, she offered to use her powers to protect the fishing fleet, for a small fee, of course. Suddenly, being a witch didn't seem so bad when it came with a steady income. As we wrap up our journey through the twisted logic of medieval witch hunts, it's worth noting that not everyone bought into the hysteria. There were voices of reason, even in those superstitious times. Some brave souls dared to question the validity of witch trials, pointing out the lack of evidence and the cruelty of the punishments. One such voice was that of Friedrich Spee, a Jesuit priest who wrote a scathing critique of witch trials in 1631. He argued that torture produced false confessions and that many innocent people were being condemned. Spee's work was published anonymously because, not wanting to be labeled a witch sympathizer and all that. So, what can we learn from this dark chapter in history? Perhaps it's that fear and ignorance are a dangerous combination, that it's all too easy to blame society's problems on the most vulnerable among us, and that, sometimes, the real monsters aren't the ones accused of witchcraft, but those doing the accusing. As we close our grimoire on medieval witch victims, take a moment to appreciate the fact that you can brew a cup of tea, own a black cat, or even wear a pointy hat without fear of being dragged to the stake. And the next time you see someone who doesn't quite fit in, maybe offer them a smile instead of suspicion. After all, you never know when you might need a little magic in your life. Witch executions in medieval Europe weren't the grand spectacles you might imagine from Hollywood. They were messy, chaotic affairs that reeked of fear, ignorance, and desperation. Most witches weren't cackling hags with pointy hats and bubbling cauldrons. They were your average Janes and Joes, caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong neighbor holding a grudge. Picture this. It's 1450, and you're living in a small village where everyone knows your business. You've got a wart on your nose, a black cat that follows you around, and you're pretty good at mixing herbs for headaches. Congratulations, you're witch material. The witch hunt usually started with whispers. Maybe your cow gave more milk than your neighbor's, or your crops didn't fail during a drought. Suddenly, you're the talk of the town, and not in a good way. People start crossing themselves when you walk by, and children throw stones at your door. But here's the kicker. Most accusers weren't evil masterminds plotting your demise. They were scared, superstitious folks looking for someone to blame for their misfortunes. Bad harvest? Must be a witch? Stillborn calf? Definitely a witch. Your husband left you for the tavern wench? You guessed it. Witch. Once accused, you'd be hauled before the local authorities. Now, these weren't highly trained legal experts. They were often the village elders, the local priest, or whoever had the biggest stick and the loudest voice. The trial was less about evidence and more about how convincing your accuser could be. Torture was a popular method of extracting confessions. They had some creative ways to make you sing like a canary. The rack, thumbscrews, and good old-fashioned beatings were all on the menu. And let's not forget the lovely swimming test. They'd tie you up and throw you in a river. If you floated, you were a witch. If you sank and drowned, well, at least you died innocent. But here's a fun fact. In some places, you could actually hire a professional witch finder. These guys were like medieval ghostbusters, except instead of catching ghosts, they caught witches. And by caught, I mean they pointed at random people and said, "Yep, that one's a witch." It was a lucrative business if you didn't mind ruining a few lives. Now let's talk about the main event, the execution. Contrary to popular belief, not all witches were burned at the stake. In England, for example, they preferred a good old-fashioned hanging. But if you were unlucky enough to be in continental Europe, you might find yourself facing the flames. The burning wasn't some organized, ticketed event. It was more like a twisted village fair. People would gather from miles around, bringing picnics and treating it like a day out. Kids would play games while waiting for the show to start. It was gruesome entertainment for a population that didn't have Netflix. The condemned witch would be led to the stake, often after being paraded through town. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about humiliation. You'd be stripped, shaved, and sometimes forced to wear a special gown. It was like the worst fashion show ever, and you were the star. As you were tied to the stake, you might get one last chance to confess. Many did, hoping for a quicker death. See, if you confessed, they might be kind enough to strangle you before lighting the fire. Small mercies, right? The fire itself was a horrific affair. It wasn't a quick flash and poof, you're gone. It was slow, agonizing, and smoky. The crowd would watch, some cheering, some praying, some probably wondering if they'd left the stove on at home. But here's a twist. Not everyone believed in witches. Some brave souls spoke out against the trials, risking accusations themselves. These were the medieval equivalent of that one friend who tells you wrestling is fake. Not always popular, but often right. After the execution, life in the village would slowly return to normal, until the next bad harvest, unexplained illness, or case of sour milk. Then the whispers would start again, and the cycle would repeat. The witch hunts weren't just about superstition. They were a perfect storm of religious fervor, political instability, and good old-fashioned human nature. People needed someone to blame for their problems, and witches were the perfect scapegoat. In the end, the real tragedy of witch executions wasn't just the innocent lives lost. It was the way it tore communities apart, turning neighbor against neighbor, friend against friend. It was a dark chapter in human history, fueled by fear, ignorance, and the dangerous belief that there's an easy explanation for life's complexities. So the next time you dress up as a witch for Halloween, remember, the real witches of history weren't cackling evildoers. They were ordinary people, caught in extraordinary circumstances, victims of a society that couldn't explain the unexplainable. And that, my friends, is scarier than any ghost story. Imagine being a witch in medieval Europe. Not the pointy hat-wearing, cauldron-stirring kind you see in fairy tales. We're talking about real women, living on the fringes of society, trying to find love in a world that feared and misunderstood them. These weren't cackling hags brewing potions in dark forests. They were herbalists, midwives, and healers. Women with knowledge that scared the ignorant and threatened the powerful. But they were also just people looking for connection in a world that often shunned them. Dating as a witch wasn't exactly a walk in the park. You couldn't just swipe right on the local blacksmith's son. Most potential suitors were more likely to run screaming than ask you out for a moonlit stroll. And forget about bringing them home to meet the family. Your familiar might eat them, or worse, they might report you to the local witch hunter. But love finds a way, even in the darkest of times. Some witches found romance with fellow outcasts, wandering minstrels, disgraced knights, or other practitioners of the magical arts. These partnerships were often based on mutual understanding and a shared sense of being different from the rest of society. Others found love in unexpected places. A sympathetic monk who saw beyond the superstitions of his time. A curious nobleman fascinated by the occult. Or even a rival witch from a neighboring village, bonding over their shared experiences of persecution and isolation. Of course, keeping a relationship going when you're constantly dodging witch hunters and angry mobs wasn't easy. Many witches lived nomadic lives, moving from place to place to avoid detection. This made long-term relationships challenging, to say the least. Imagine trying to maintain a long-distance romance in an era without phones or even reliable postal service. And then there was the whole issue of children. Witches who chose to have families faced unique challenges. How do you explain to your kids why mommy can't attend the local harvest festival without being burned at the stake? And don't even get started on the parent-teacher meetings at the village school. But it wasn't all doom and gloom. Witches often formed tight-knit communities, supporting each other through the trials of love and life. These covens became surrogate families, offering a sense of belonging that many witches couldn't find elsewhere. In these secret gatherings, romance often blossomed. Picture a clandestine Beltane celebration, firelight flickering on faces usually hidden in shadow, eyes meeting across a moonlit clearing, sparks flying that had nothing to do with magic spells. Some witches found creative ways to blend in with regular society, leading double lives that would put modern-day spies to shame. By day, they might be the quiet widow who ran the local apothecary. By night, they'd slip away to secret meetings with their magical lover, sharing forbidden knowledge and stolen kisses under the stars. But let's not romanticize things too much. Being a witch in medieval Europe was dangerous business. The constant threat of discovery hung over every relationship like a dark cloud. One wrong move, one jealous neighbor, and you could find yourself facing accusations that would tear your life apart. Imagine the heartbreak of watching your lover turn against you, convinced by the hysteria of a witch hunt. Or the gut-wrenching decision to leave everything behind, including the person you loved, to escape persecution. Yet even in these darkest moments, there were glimmers of hope. Stories circulated of witches who found true love, partners who stood by them through thick and thin, tales of daring escapes, of couples who fled to distant lands to start new lives together, free from the fear and prejudice of their old homes. These stories became legends, passed down in whispers from one generation of witches to the next. They offered hope to those still searching for their own happy endings, proof that love could survive even in the harshest of circumstances. Of course, not all witches were interested in romantic love. Some found fulfillment in their craft, in the deep connection they felt with nature and the unseen forces of the world. For them, solitude was a choice, not a punishment. Others formed close bonds with their familiars, animal companions believed to assist in magical workings. These relationships, while not romantic in nature, often provided the emotional support and companionship that humans couldn't or wouldn't offer. As the centuries passed and attitudes slowly began to change, life for witches gradually improved. The witch hunts faded into history, and practitioners of the old ways found more acceptance in some corners of society. But the legacy of those medieval witches and their quest for love lives on. In the stories we tell, in the way we view outsiders and those who are different. And perhaps in the magic that still sparks when two people connect, defying all odds and expectations. So the next time you're swiping through dating apps or complaining about the modern dating scene, spare a thought for those medieval witches. They navigated love and relationships with courage, creativity, and a dash of magic, all while trying not to get burned at the stake. Who knows? Maybe their spirit lives on in you. That unexplained connection you feel with someone, the way your heart skips a beat when your eyes meet across a crowded room. Perhaps it's a little bit of that old magic, still working its charms in our modern world. And if you ever find yourself on a date with someone who seems a little different, a bit mysterious, with an uncanny knowledge of herbs and a black cat that follows them everywhere, well, who knows? You might just be part of the next chapter in a very old story. A tale of love, magic, and the enduring human spirit, with maybe just a touch of Eye of Newt. The witch trials of medieval Europe weren't just a blip in history. They were a cultural earthquake that shook society to its core, leaving cracks we're still tripping over today. From the way we talk to the laws we make, the witch's legacy is everywhere, hiding in plain sight like a toad familiar under a bush. Let's start with language. Ever gone on a witch hunt at work? Accused someone of casting a spell on your crush? Congratulated a friend on their magic touch with plants? Congrats, you're keeping the spirit of 1692 alive and well. Our everyday speech is peppered with witchy references, each one a linguistic time capsule from an era when magic was feared and women were dangerous. But it's not just our words that carry echoes of the trials. Our legal system still bears the scars of witch hunt hysteria. The concept of beyond reasonable doubt, that came from judges trying to put the brakes on witch trial madness. They figured if you're going to burn someone alive, you'd better be damn sure they deserved it. Thanks, witch hunters, for accidentally giving us due process. And let's not forget about science. The witch trials were a clash between superstition and reason didn't always win. But the pushback against witch hunt logic helped fuel the scientific revolution. Every time you take medicine based on clinical trials, instead of dancing naked under a full moon, you can thank the skeptics who dared to question whether that old lady down the street really could control the weather. Speaking of weather, climate change deniers and anti-vaxxers, they're using the same logical fallacies that got people accused of witchcraft. Bad harvest must be witches. Has become weird weather? Can't be human caused. The witch's legacy lives on in conspiracy theories and magical thinking, proving we haven't entirely shaken off our superstitious past. But it's not all doom and gloom. The trials also sparked early discussions about women's rights and religious freedom. When you see a pride parade or a Wiccan gathering in the park, you're witnessing the long-term fallout of people questioning why certain groups were being persecuted. The witch hunts, in their twisted way, helped plant the seeds of tolerance. Of course, we can't talk about witches without mentioning pop culture. From Bewitched to Harry Potter, our entertainment is obsessed with magic. But notice how screen witches are often powerful women who don't play by society's rules. That's no accident. We're still working through our cultural baggage about female power and autonomy, one Netflix series at a time. Even fashion hasn't escaped the witch's influence. That pointy black hat? It started as anti-Semitic propaganda, morphed into a witch stereotype, and now it's a Halloween staple. Your goth phase wasn't just teenage rebellion. It was you tapping into centuries of witch aesthetics. Who knew your eyeliner was so historically loaded? But perhaps the most lasting impact of the witch trials is how they changed the way we view outsiders. The hunts taught us to fear the different, the eccentric, the unexplained. That suspicion of the other still lurks in our collective psyche, rearing its ugly head in everything from immigration debates to neighborhood gossip. On the flip side, the trials also taught us the dangers of mob mentality and unchecked power. Every time we stand up for the accused, demand evidence, or question authority, we're channeling the hard-learned lessons of Salem and beyond. The witch hunts were a cautionary tale written in blood and ash, one we're still trying not to repeat. So next time you're stirring your coffee, widdershins, or calling something wicked cool, remember, you're not just speaking English. You're speaking witch. Our language, our laws, our very way of thinking has been shaped by those long-ago trials. The witches may be gone, but their influence lingers like wood smoke on a crisp autumn night. In the end, The legacy of the witch trials isn't just about pointy hats and broomsticks. It's about how fear can warp a society, how progress can emerge from darkness, and how the past never really stays buried. We may have traded our cauldrons for instant pots, but the witch's shadow still looms large over our modern world. So the next time you feel like an outsider, remember, you're in good company. The witches of old were the square pegs, the troublemakers, the ones who dared to be different. In their memory, maybe we can all embrace our inner witch a little more. Just, skip the part with the burning stakes. We've learned that lesson at least.